Welcome to another lesson in the American Industrial Revolution series. Today will be all about railroads. Here's some vocab for you to get started with. The railroad industry undergoes a lot of growth and some major consolidation during the Industrial Revolution. Many of these changes greatly benefited the nation, but they also led to corruption that required regulations from the government. As we look at the railroad industry, it's important to note that railroads made westward expansion a reality for more Americans. So the U.S. government helped railroad companies develop railroad networks. In 1859, railroads extended out west as far as the Missouri River. 10 years later, the first transcontinental railroad was complete. Now that railroads spanned the nation, Cornelius Vanderbilt began to link the existing railroads with smaller railroad networks. These railroads offered Americans opportunities that previously didn't exist, such as land, adventure, and a fresh start for many. A diverse group of individuals built the railroads, often under harsh conditions. The Central Pacific Railroad hired Chinese immigrants, and the Union Pacific hired Irish immigrants as well as Civil War veterans. Throughout the building of the railroads, accidents and the spread of disease disabled and killed thousands of workers every year. The railroad industry played a hand in how we live our lives to this day, in the way we tell time. In 1869, C.F. Dowd proposed dividing Earth into 24 time zones. In 1883, U.S. railroads and towns centered around the railroads adopted these time zones. A year later, in an international conference, the world adopted the time zones, and the U.S. Congress fully adopted these time zones in 1918. The railroads opened opportunities for others as well. The demand of the railroad industry for raw material alone helped many businesses grow, and the railroad network helped towns grow and established new markets. In order for the railroads to grow at the pace that America needed them to grow, the iron, coal, steel, and lumber industries would have to grow to meet that demand. Now that railroads linked isolated towns, a town would no longer have to be self-sustaining. Towns could rely on other towns to produce things that they weren't producing. This promoted a large national trading network of suppliers as new markets developed continuously. Towns began to specialize in specific products and could sell large quantities of their products nationally. In 1880, George Pullman built a railcar factory on the prairie in Illinois. Pullman provided housing, doctors, shops, and sports facilities for his employees and their families in an effort to tightly control residents to ensure a stable workforce. The control and large profits led some railroad magnates into corruption. The stakeholders of the Union Pacific form a construction company called Credit Mobilier. The Union Pacific overpay for the laying of track, and stakeholders pocket the profits. Many Republican politicians are implicated in this endeavor, and the reputation of the Republican Party is tarnished. In order to combat some of this corruption, the Grangers began to demand government regulations. Farmers began to get angry over some perceived railroad corruption. First, the farmers saw that railroads were selling government lands to businesses and not to settlers. Second, the railroads fixed their prices, which kept farmers in debt. And lastly, the railroads were charging different customers different rates. The Grangers are going to step in and press for laws that protect the farmers' best interests. The Grangers are going to sponsor state as well as local political candidates. And in Monroe v. Illinois, the Supreme Court agrees that states can regulate the railroad. The Supreme Court ruling set the precedent that the federal government can regulate private industry. In 1886, the Supreme Court states that the states cannot set rates on interstate commerce. The next year, with public outcry, the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 goes into effect, and it states that the federal government can supervise the railroads. It also establishes the Interstate Commerce Commission. Legal battles with railroads will ensue, and this makes it difficult for the Interstate Commerce Commission to take any action. Many railroads almost face bankruptcy due to abuse of power, mismanagement, and competition. Problems with the railroad contribute to the Panic of 1893, which leads to a depression. And by mid-1894, 1/4 of all railroads are taken over by financial companies. Now there's 2 more questions you'll need to add to your vocab notes.